century. And my question for you today is very simple. I want, for the next 20 minutes, to talk to you about how we can view politics today through the lens of what's happening in the ancient world. So Luke asked me to come and talk to you today about dictators of the late Republic. And so accordingly, I'm going to be focusing on Julius Caesar and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, two dictators of the 1st century BC. But also, I want us to branch out and think a bit about dictators in our own day. And I want us to explore how the visual language of dictatorship has remained consistent throughout the centuries. In other words, my point for you today is that dictators in our own times, some of whom you're going to recognize in my talk, are following a model that the Romans perfected in the 1st century BC. Kim Il-sung, Putin, Trump, they are all basically Caesars and Sullas. And that is my point for you today. Now, before I begin, I think it's important for us to define our terms. Now, what exactly do I mean when I talk about a dictator? I say this because in English, our word dictator has a very different meaning to the Roman word dictator. When in English we talk about a dictator today, we basically mean a tyrant. We mean a figure who uses their power in an illegitimate or a cruel or tyrannical way. So for us, that is what dictator today means. But in Rome, dictators were something very similar indeed. You see, in Rome, the dictator was a legitimate emergency official. In other words, in Rome in 1st century BC or up to the 1st century BC, to be a dictator, you were an appointed official and you wielded extraordinary power for up to 6 months. As a dictator, you could be the supreme commander of Rome's armies in war. You could organize elections. You could propose laws. And in a sense, as a dictator in Rome, you were considered above the law. This is, in fact, a point of scholarly debate. Scholars don't entirely agree on the extent to which the appointment of a dictator in Rome suspends the usual constitution. But the general point seems to be that you can't prosecute a dictator for his actions in office, right? So Rome is going through an emergency. Rome appoints a dictator to deal with the emergency, and you can't call him account. You can't call him out for what he does while he's in office. So at least while he's in office, he's above the law. That sounds like a pretty powerful chap. The right to command Rome's armies, to instruct the magistrates and officials of Rome, and even to be above the law. But in Rome, dictators' powers were limited by certain conditions. First, in Rome, a dictator is only appointed for a specific task, and the dictator has to resign his powers upon the completion of his task. So that might be fighting a military campaign, it might be organizing elections, it might be organizing a special ritual to appease the gods if the gods were angry with the Roman polity, and so on and so forth. Alternatively, if the dictator couldn't achieve or fulfill his task within 6 months, then he had to resign anyway. You can't be dictator for longer than 6 months in Rome. And third and finally, the Roman dictator mustn't leave Italy. A Roman dictator can only wield his power within Italy and within the city of Rome itself. So the Roman idea of a dictator is very different indeed to the modern idea of a dictator. But I'm going to argue here that in the 1st century BC, in the age of Julius Caesar, what it meant to be a dictator was changing and became more similar to our idea of a dictator, i.e. to a tyrant or a despot. Now, Rome uses dictators for centuries throughout its history, throughout the conquest of Italy, for example, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But for Latinists in the room, you might already have worked out where the word dictator in Latin comes from. It comes from a Latin verb, dico, dicere, dixi, dictum. Lots of Latinists in the room will know your principal parts. Dico means to say or to speak or to tell. And that gives us in Latin the word dictator. Dictator means one who speaks or one who commands or one who tells. So there's the etymology. And of course, we're still using this Latin word in English to describe what a dictator is, what a tyrant is. As I've mentioned, Rome uses dictators throughout the period of the conquest of Italy. And we see in our literary sources, we see mentions of dictators being appointed for 6-month terms, remember, no more than 6 months, throughout the 5th, the 4th, and the 3rd centuries BC. So what you have to remember about Roman history is that Rome was not always the mistress of the Mediterranean world, right? If you go back to 500 BC, 400 BC, 300 BC, Rome is still a small state in Italy. But gradually over the centuries, it conquered the Italian peninsula. And that's probably one reason why the dictator is only allowed to rule in Italy, because when he was appointed in early Roman history, it was for the purposes of waging war in Italy, waging war against the Italian tribes. Now, Rome completes the conquest of Italy from right up in the north in the region of modern-day Lombardy down to Sicily. It completes that process by the middle of the 3rd century BC. And what's peculiar about the dictatorship in Rome at that point is that Rome stops using dictators. The last dictator is appointed in Rome in 202 BC. He's a chap called Geminus. And then Rome stops using dictators altogether for 120 years. So if we want to divide the Roman dictatorship into phases, then we could say that from 202 BC down to 82 BC, the dictatorship is basically in abeyance. It's not being used. Rome stops appointing dictators. But the period I want to focus on for the next 15 minutes, and the period that's really interesting, is the 1st century BC, because Rome starts using dictators again from 82 to 81 BC, and then from 49 to 44 BC. And you will already know probably who those figures are. The first of them is Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and the second of them is our focus today, Julius Caesar, and he's dictator for 5 years. Note that, that's the very important point here, that the dictators of the 1st century BC break the rules. They reign for longer than 6 months. And in Julius Caesar's case, in the 40s BC, he's dictator for 5 years. So the 1st century BC dictators are basically kings. They make themselves into kings. They rule for longer than 6 months. They break the rules, and they come closer to our modern idea of what a dictator is: a tyrant, a despot, someone who is wielding an illegitimate sort of power. So those are going to be our focuses for the next 15 minutes. On the left, I've given you a rather dashing portrait of Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator from 49 to 44, and this bust can now be found in the Archaeological Museum of Sparta. And on the right, a probably later portrait bust of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and this is from the Neue Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen. So I'm going to be using these two for the next 15 minutes as a case study in how dictators in the 1st century BC are becoming charismatic leaders, are becoming tyrants, are promoting themselves and using propaganda to get their message out. And I'm going to be exploring how they, Caesar and Sulla, laid the framework for later dictators and for the dictators of our own time. So I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons with the modern day here until we say goodbye. Our questions then: how did Sulla and Caesar in the 1st century BC change the dictatorship from a legitimate emergency office into a form of monarchy or personal rule? How did these dictators promote themselves through coins, through buildings, through sculptures, through writing? That's crucial. And how similar or dissimilar are their methods to modern dictators today? People like Putin, Trump, and the Kims, and so on and so forth. So those are our questions that I want you to keep at the front of your mind while I'm chatting away. So I think when we're thinking about dictatorial methods and dictatorial modes of communication, we can divide this into broadly 2 categories. There are actually more, but we don't have time today. The first of these is the cult of personality, the way in which the dictator creates a cult of personality, where they and their person are almost the ideal man or a godlike figure. The second theme we'll be exploring is their use of propaganda. So how do they use visual media? How do they create visual symbols that promote themselves and legitimize their dictatorial reigns? Now, let's start with the cult of personality. Let's begin with point one, because you see, for the dictators of the 1st century BC, for Julius Caesar and Sulla, one of the most important ways in which they created a cult of personality was through writing, was through autobiography. One of the things that we forget about Caesar and Sulla is that they were authors, particularly Caesar. We're going to be hearing extracts of his work later, but also Sulla. We know that Sulla wrote an autobiographical memoir, just in the same way that modern politicians write memoirs after their time in office. We know about Sulla's memoirs because of a chance notice in Plutarch's biography of Sulla. So that's written in the late 1st century AD by a Greek man. He writes this autobiography, this biopic of the Roman general and dictator Sulla. And he tells us that Sulla wrote memoirs. He says, I quote, as follows: Sulla writes in his own memoirs that when he was dispatched with an army to the social war, a great chasm in the earth opened near Liverna, from which a great quantity of fire burst forth and a bright flame towered up toward the heavens. Then the priests declared that a brave man of rare courage and surpassing appearance would one day take the government in hand and free the city from its present troubles. And Sulla writes in his own memoirs that he himself was this man because his golden head of hair gave him a singular appearance. Now, let's leave aside for a moment the image of a golden-haired dictator with a singular appearance, and let's focus instead just on the significance of what Sulla was trying to do. Sulla had a controversial career. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was a Roman general. He fought in a great civil war against one of his political opponents called Marius. He defeated him and his son, and he made himself dictator, and he became a sort of tyrant or despot for a time. Sulla is writing this memoir to justify his rise to power. He says that it was prophesied, it was predicted by the soothsayers and priests that a brave man like him would one day come to save Rome from its troubles. So for Sulla, and arguably Sulla begins this tradition, writing, autobiographical writing, is a way of creating a cult of personality. It was a way of creating a myth, a mythos, to return to Dunstan's earlier word, for himself, to explain and justify his rise to power. This technique of using writing to justify your extraordinary levels of power as a politician has been played out again and again in our own times. Think about Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, written in prison. This is his vision for the Third Reich. This is his vision for Germany, but it's also a self-justifying text. This is the text in which Adolf Hitler wished to justify his career and promote himself. We can also think about the recent-ish book of Vladimir Putin, entitled An Astonishingly Frank Self-Portrait by Russia's President, an autobiographical work by Vladimir Putin himself. And works like this by dictators are actually quite convincing for some. I give you on the screen a review from a UK-based customer who said they thought this was an interesting book. It tells about Putin, warts and all. He's not an ogre, he's a good leader and a great man. We get a very skewed view of Russia here in the West from the media. This is an example of dictatorial writing that works, and it works because the late Republican dictators perfected that format. If you have a controversial career, write a book about it, create, shape the narrative. And that's something that still works in our own times. Julius Caesar was very receptive to this technique as well. Julius Caesar, in addition to writing the Gallic Wars, also wrote a commentary on the civil wars. Most of you know already that Julius Caesar goes to war against his political opponents in the Roman Senate in about 50 BC. He crosses the Rubicon and he invades Italy, and he defeats his great enemy, Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. And after the civil war, Caesar does the same thing as Sulla does. He does the same thing as Putin does. He does the same thing as Adolf Hitler. He writes a self-justifying account. So in his civil wars, this, as follows, is the way that Caesar describes his own entry into Italy, right? His invasion of his homeland, leading an army of loyal veterans against his own city. This is what he says about it. Setting out southward to Rome from Auximium, Caesar traverses the whole of the region of Picenum in central Italy. All the officials in those parts receive him with the utmost gladness, and they assist him with supplies of every kind. Even from Singulum, envoys come to Caesar and promise to do his bidding with the utmost eagerness. Caesar's account of his march into Italy, his invasion of his own country, is totally skewed here. He sounds like a hero. He makes out that the people of Italy welcome him with open arms. They're delighted that he's invaded their land. So you see, the late Republican dictators used writing as a way of creating a cult of personality, making themselves into godlike figures that are welcomed with open arms by all. They created and shaped the narrative. And I mean, we may even look forward to other modern dictators or dictatorial figures. We may consider, for example, Donald Trump, who has an army of shadow writers to write books for him, painting him in a pleasing light. This is only one of many Trump tweets on the subject of Donald Trump's literary output, such as it is, that I could provide here. Writing is crucial because writing enables dictators to control the narrative. The second thing that I want us to focus on is the use of propaganda. And that's my last case study for you today. Roman dictators perfected the art in the 1st century BC of using visual media as a way of propagandizing, as a way of propagating their image and of convincing the masses to keep them on side. They used buildings. Think about Caesar's Temple of Venus or Sulla's Tabularium, which I'll talk about in a moment. Think about coins. Both Sulla and Caesar minted coins, and I'll show you some examples of that too. Statues, both had statues. We're lucky to have some evidence of a statue of Sulla in particular. And spectacle, triumphal celebrations, games, festivals, great appearances, speeches. All of these are aspects of the communication of the late Republican dictator. And all of these are techniques, are modes of communication still used by modern dictators today. Let's consider coins, because I love coins. My great love is Roman numismatics, so I'm always eager to be talking about coins. The coin that's going to be showing up on your screen now is a gold aureus, so a small gold piece minted to commemorate the Roman dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla sometime in around 80 BC. Now, the obverse, so the face side, that's on the left of your screen, is a helmeted bust of the goddess Roma. It's a very traditional, very conventional image. And what Sulla is trying to say is, even though I'm dictator, don't worry, because Rome still continues as usual. The goddess Roma, the goddess Rome, she's still here. It asserts continuity. But look at the reverse on the right-hand side of your screen. This is without question a depiction of an actual statue of Lucius Cornelius Sulla himself. It's a gilded equestrian statue. The dictator Sulla sits in a toga with his right arm extended in an ad locutio pose. So he's addressing his troops or addressing the people. And the legend around it, the text around the image, also tells us something about the way that Sulla wanted people to perceive him in his reign. You should be able to make out the words El Sul Feli, and it's kind of curved around the coin. You see the word Feli is collapsed in half. This means Lucius Sulla Felix, or Lucius Sulla, blessed by fortune, or the lucky, or the fortunate. So he's using this coin as a way of saying, there's a reason I won in the wars. It's because I'm blessed by the goddess of fortune. I am Felix. I am the lucky one. I was meant to be here. Caesar very similarly used coins as a visual language to promote himself and to promote the ideology of his regime. This coin is from 44 BC. It's from about February 44 BC, so just before Julius Caesar's assassination. We know that because on the face side, the text around it says, Caesar, dictator for life. So this must be after Caesar became dictator for life, king, in February 44 BC. The face side of this coin is so exciting because it is our first ever Roman coin depicting a living Roman on the face side. What we have to remember is that Roman coins put gods on the face side, not men. But by putting his own head on the face side, Caesar is communicating that he is godlike, in a sense. This coin is all about promoting him. But at the same time, he's trying to be cozy and cuddly as well. Check out the reverse of the coin on the right-hand side. Note those clasped hands, that handshake. That's a symbol of concordia or concord or harmony. He's trying to emphasize that under his reign as dictator for life, he's bringing harmony. He's bringing concord back to Rome. He's repairing the wounds of the recent civil war that brought him to power. Of course, we all know what happened to Julius Caesar. On the Ides of March, on the 15th of March, 44 BC, he said the fateful words, et tu brute, even though he didn't say that, he said, kai su teknon, and you, my child, and then he fell, and Roman history was changed forever. In a very similar way, modern dictators have used coinage to communicate the ideology of their regime. Think about the coinage of Kim Il-sung, the dictator of North Korea until some years ago. Note on the obverse side, the face sign side, his smiling face. He is giving across a cozy, cuddly, warm, pleasant image to mask the brutality that lay beneath his regime. We might also consider the recent coinage, just from a few years ago, of Vladimir Putin. Putin gives us a very different face of a dictator. Note the sternness of his expression on the obverse side. This is a man that you do not mess with. And that message, that face, that sternness, that charismatic generalship and leadership and strength is communicated also by the visual language of the reverse, the right-hand side of this coin. This is a commemorative coin commemorating the seizure of Crimea in recent years. And you can see the region of Crimea featured on the coin, and above it, the imperial eagle, the symbol of Rome and then the symbol of the Russian Empire. When empires use eagles, they are implicitly recalling the world of Rome, the aquila, the eagle standard of Rome. This is an imperial coin. This is a Roman emperor's coin, but it's Putin who's doing it. Now, our last 2 minutes, I think we can focus on buildings before I tie this up. Buildings too are a crucial way in which the late Republican dictators created an image of charismatic leadership. Think about the temple of Venus Genetrix, the temple of Venus the Mother. Many of you will know already, of course, the famous tale that Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus. He argued that his gens, the gens Julia, was descended from Venus herself. So when in 46 BC, he built a monumental new temple to Venus Genetrix, he was advertising not just his wealth and power, which you can see in the columns and the fine architecture, but also he was emphasizing his divine lineage. He was saying that he was, in effect, the descendant of a god. And other ancient dictators, like Lucius Cornelius Sulla in the 80s, used building to impose themselves, to make their mark on the city of Rome itself. Think about Sulla. Sulla built this vast so-called tabularium, a vast office, a vast archive above the Roman Forum. And you can still see the foundations today. His building, his tabularium, looms over the Roman Forum. It looms over the heart of civic and political life in Rome. So you see, you can't go to the Roman Forum anymore without seeing Sulla at the top. Sulla is everywhere that you see. So ancient Roman dictators also used buildings as a way of stamping their mark on the city of Rome. And of course, modern dictators have followed in the same suit. How could they not? Think about Hitler. Think about his Reichschancellery, so his offices, which were built in Berlin in 1939. the layout and the organization and the detail of his Reichschancellery, of his offices in Berlin, are distinctly Roman. Look at the columns on the facade. Look at the classical themed sculptures in bronze at the left and right side of the entrance, and note once again the imperial eagle, the eagle of empire, which is the eagle of Rome. Just like Caesar and Sulla before him, Hitler aimed to make his mark on the city and make buildings a living monument to himself. We might also compare this with more recent projects by dictatorial figures in modern history, such as Trump's failed border wall along the border with Mexico. This too is a dictatorial figure changing the landscape around them, seeking to create a monument to themselves. You cannot look at Trump's wall without thinking of Trump, just as you cannot look at the Reichschancellery without thinking of Hitler, and just as you can't look at the Temple of Venus Genetrix without thinking of Caesar himself. The visual language is a consistent theme of dictatorship. So to sum up, the Romans of the 1st century BC, Sulla and Caesar in particular, created the model for how dictatorial power is expressed and articulated and legitimized throughout history. The slew of modern dictators have followed in their wake. Trump, Putin, Hitler, Stalin, the Kims, all other despots have been using methods that ultimately were perfected by Roman dictators to legitimize their reigns. Now, who is supposed to be receiving this? Who is supposed to be impressed by these displays of dictatorial communication? Well, I would argue that these methods aim to build a sufficient power place among the masses. Coins, buildings, monuments, all the rest, they're not to impress the elite. They are there in order to entrench the power of the dictator among the masses. That is what the Romans, Sulla and Caesar were trying to do, and that, I would argue, is what our modern dictators are trying to do. They're not using new techniques. We can see Rome all around us, constantly, and never more in the language of power. Thank you very much for paying attention.